I was a police officer working the desk between 3 and 11 p.m. A fire alarm signal goes off. Many years ago, the police department offered alarm monitoring services. We still had 10 or 12 places that were hardwired, and it would require pulling apart a lot of equipment to disconnect the system, so we just kept it going. First shift dispatch is already punched in, so she took it. I'm headed out of the door to the fire department when 911 rings from the same address. I answer it. No one in the other end. I assumed they barely got to the call before passing out. I bolt out the back door, hop in a squad car, radio the 911 call on channel 3 that both police and fire can hear, and that I'm going directly to the house. I arrive just after another unit shows up. No sign of smoke, no sign of anything. An older woman comes walking up the street, pushing a wheelchair with an elderly lady, her mother. They live there and just went out for an early evening stroll before dinner. I tell them what we have going on. Nobody else lives there, and as far as the elderly lady can remember, the alarm was disconnected from the house years ago during some renovations. They don't have any alarm system either, just a couple of smoke detectors. They were just your standard fire alarms that took batteries, not even hardwired into the electric. This was 20+ years ago. We do a walk around the house, get to the back door off the kitchen, and you can clearly smell gas, and we could also see the distortion that gas creates. We turned off the gas at the main, set up some fans to air it out, and find a cracked gas line going to the oven. The daughter said she spilled some coffee she was making for their walk and had to move the oven a few inches to clean it. Probably broke the line pushing the oven back in. Nothing else in the house is disturbed, and both phones are on the hook. The fire chief shows up about 15 minutes into the call. He goes over the two ladies and gives them both a hug. He's nearly in tears. The elderly lady in the wheelchair, her husband was the fire chief 60+ years ago for our department. And the daughter, her husband passed away a few years ago. He was also a member of our department. Never believed in ghosts or spirits, but that call made me think, maybe, people who spend their lives doing good are allowed by some power to look over their loved ones every so often. It's August 2017. About 2 in the morning. It's pouring and there are thunderstorms going on. A 911 call comes in and dispatch just reports yells and screams and cries in the background. There's a case of shooting in downtown and we are understaffed. My partner can't come as he is assisting the city. Dispatch calls me in and says, "Patrol 1, answer to 348, Grove Street. Complainant is having issues communicating. SOS. Possible danger. Blood." I don't have time to think. I want to back up, but I'm running. I reply saying, "Dispatch, Patrol 1, mark me en route on my way. Need backup within the next 10. I'm on it, over and out." I reach the place within 4 minutes and 23 seconds. I'm the closest on-duty officer. One is doing traffic, road patrol, and a couple of others have been pulled into the downtown area for an emergency. As I reach the house, I get out and hear a lot of voices screaming. It's very loud, all together with the vicious rains, thunderbolts, and still you can hear constant yelling and screaming from the house. I get ready and pull out my gun and have a, "oh crap, this is serious," thing going on in my mind. The door is open. I break in and I notice blood. There's a trail of it all along. You see it on the floors, splashed across the walls, going across the kitchen, and I just follow the blood path into the basement from where the noise and the wailing is coming. I'm not going to lie, my heart is pounding at this point. I'm assuming anything could happen right now, but I have a duty, and decide I'm going to nail the guy and tell myself, "You got this, dude. Let's go." For Spring County. As I walk down the basement, I see a woman crying and pointing me to the other end of the basement. I see a guy and his girlfriend sitting on the couch of this furnished basement. The dude is bleeding, with gash and scars across his face, arms and neck. The girlfriend has got some severe injuries and is bleeding from the mouth, and I find out she has a fractured arm as well. The woman explains to me that the guy is her nephew, and he has had a drunk escapade. He tried to get inside the home through the kitchen along with his girlfriend, who was also drunk. He had forgotten his keys, and had even forgotten his aunt was staying over. He made the decision to break inside his own home through the kitchen window and climb 1.5 stories. When he realized that the kitchen door was tight shut, he decided to break the window open with his head, banged his head a few times using his body weight, and finally punched it hard, falling inside the sink along with the glass pieces, and then tumbling down and falling onto the ground along with the pieces. He somehow gets the stamina and gets up and pulls his drunk girlfriend, who is also trying to break in, and drags her in. Since he's drunk as well, he loses control of her, and she fell somewhere, breaking a tooth, and some glass pieces cut her as well. During this commotion, the aunt wakes up and tries to reason with these morons, but they are at a whole different level. This is when the call was done and I came into the picture. I realized that this is not a violent scene, but a case of extreme stupidity. I have very few minutes. Both the man and the woman are bleeding. I don't even know what the injuries the guy has internally. Concussion maybe. The EMS have been called from my end. They're on the way. I remember something I had learned at the academy, and tell the guy that if he wants to stop the blood flow, he should use my tourniquet. I warn him it will be painful, but he absolutely needs to do it. I apply the tourniquet to the neck area and notice a deep gash on his neck. EMS arrive inside 20 minutes, and the paramedics tell me that had I not applied the tourniquet, the dude would have bled out long before they got there. I find out that they are both safe the next day, but boy, it was a complete holy crap moment for me. First, I thought I was in the middle of a violent psychopathic murder scene. Then I realized that there are two people who need urgent help, failing which a lot of crap can go down inside the house. Luckily, the EMS and paramedics did a superb job and saved the dude and his girl. And not to forget, the biggest savior that night was the aunt. Imagine what would have happened if she wasn't around. The man would have bled to death. They say aunts are like your second mums. This is what the aunt was for him. She gave him a second life. However, I still get mad thinking how this dude literally killed himself after drinking in a tragically comical way. What a moron. God bless him and give him better wisdom. A couple of years ago, I was working in a southwestern US state. At the time, the city I worked in was literally a few miles from the border. As such, human trafficking was a big issue. The men who are paid to smuggle people across the border are nicknamed coyotes. I don't know why. These people are crazy. They have no regard for life and have no qualms about shooting or murdering LEOs or BP agents. The amount of money they make smuggling people across the border, I've heard, is astronomical, and I guess the prospects of reporting failures to the Mexican cartels makes one willing to carry out insane risks. Anyway, my very first shift working nights, my partner and I were cruising behind a Chevy Silverado 2500 when he pointed out that he suspected the driver of DUI. It wasn't so much obvious to me at the time because I was new at it, but after the third time the truck crossed over the double solid lines on the 2-lane country road we were on, he decided to call it in. While we were waiting on control to respond to our query, The truck abruptly pulled into a dirt road and sped up in front of us. I should mention now that it was 1 to 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night, on the outskirts of a small southwestern town. I wasn't too familiar with the multitude of dirt roads during the daytime, let alone driving at night. Anyway, control comes back. The plates are clean, but that wasn't saying much, as coyotes were known to steal plates from other vehicles and place them on theirs. While my partner is just about to hit his lights, the truck suddenly skids to a stop. A few seconds go by, and no one exits the vehicle. The windows are all tinted so dark that we can't even tell how many occupants there are inside. We train our spotlights on their rearview mirrors, so they can't see and open our doors. My partner draws his pistol, and I grab the shotgun. We both have our weapons trained on the vehicle, and my mind is just racing. The hairs on the back of my neck are standing up. After a handful of seconds crawl by, the driver's side door suddenly opens. A teenage girl jumps out with a seemingly crazed look on her face and charges at us. She's screaming something at us as well, but I can't make it out for the sound of blood rushing in my ears. Oh yeah, the adrenaline is definitely kicking in. My partner calls something out, trying to get her to stop, but she either can't hear him or doesn't care. It isn't until I chamber around before she stops in her tracks and looks over at me. That finally stopped her. Long story short, she was texting while driving and got spooked that she was being followed by a car down the dirt path to her family's farm. What makes this scary for me is that because of the environment we were in, with all the stories of the coyotes' run-ins with LEAs that I had heard, and my rookie status, I could have easily shot an innocent civilian had I drawn my pistol instead of handling the shotgun. During my time working as a reserve officer, I would often leave my driver's side window open because I still smoked at the time, and I didn't like having the smoke remaining in the vehicle, allowing the stench to linger. This was something I would do whether it was in the heat of summer or dead cold of winter. Unfortunately, when it was raining, I wouldn't smoke in the car. Eventually, even in the dead of winter, I got used to having my window down all the time. Well, at least when parked, working traffic, with forward and rear Doppler radar. One such night, it was miserably cold outside, when I received a radio call for service for a burglary in progress at a private residence in my town. I requested backup, who happened to be the chief of the police department, named Adam. For safety, I opted to wait for him to meet me at the station before I drove to the location of the complaint. By the time we got there, the thief had already left, and did so on an expensive bike he took during the burglary. We got back to the station, but instead of dropping him off, I pulled a fast Yui and stopped right there in the middle of the road. Adam started to question why I had my window down, especially since it was so cold out. At just that moment, I shushed him, and just barely, I could hear a dog barking several blocks away. I have extremely sensitive hearing. I asked Adam if he heard it, and he said, "Heard what?" I replied, "The dog." He said he hadn't, but I listened for a moment longer, and was able to determine where the noise was coming from, and took off in that direction. Sure enough, we pulled up on a dim-wit 18-year-old male, riding the stolen bike with great difficulty, and his arms were desperately trying to hang on to the other items he had just stolen. We got out and made the arrest. I put the bike in the trunk and drove back to the station. The entire time during the drive to the station, Adam was looking at me like I had just performed a God mode move, and actually said so. I told him it was just my hearing, and something I never would have been able to hear if the window was up. After I dropped him off back at the station, I went back to the scene of arrest, with the kid safely tucked away in the rear of my patrol car behind the cage. I went back to the arrest scene so I could take a series of photos. As I mentioned before, this was in the dead of winter. It just happened to have started snowing just before Adam got to me, and the only tracks in the snow leading from the point of arrest into the direction of the complainant's home were from the bike. Game, set, match. After returning to the victim's home to return the stolen items, which I already inventoried and photographed for the report, I drove the kid to the county jail and booked him for first-degree burglary, a felony. He later took a plea, amending it to a misdemeanor, receiving an SIS and 1 year of probation. It's just too bad it hadn't been snowing long enough for me to backtrace the path all the way to the victim's home, but it was only like a block or two before it started. For any rookies out there, if you're looking for a suspect on foot or a bike, stop and listen. Dogs don't usually bark just to hear themselves do so. Use all of your senses and try to focus on minute details. You never know what kind of crime you can solve by doing so. So, early in my career, I was a reserve officer for a neighbouring city and took an evening shift for the full-time officer who had called in sick. So I thought, sweet, money, money, money. The night was boring. Well, most of it. But the best part wasn't what happened while on my tour. It was what came after. As I drove back towards my hometown, I was taking the exit to circle around onto the northbound lanes of another highway. Just as I got to the bridge over the one I had exited from, a car comes swerving out of nowhere, slides against the guardrail, throwing up a ton of sparks, then jerks back into the northbound lanes. Yeah, back and forth. By this time, I was already on the phone with the city police. This driver was so drunk, there was no way I was going to let her go. So I followed her. She quickly caught on to the fact that I was following her. It didn't help that I was also a volunteer firefighter, so I had a full light bar on my SUV at the time. It also didn't help that I was a company officer on the FD, so I had red and blue lights in a candy cane setup with clear lenses in between, where normally we'd only be able to run blue lights. Didn't matter. Everyone knew I was a cop. So this lady was really doing her best to shake me, cutting corners while hitting a couple of guardrails, running stop signs, a stop light, almost ploughing into oncoming traffic. If she had been speeding, I would probably have gone back from behind her, as it was getting really dangerous. As we neared the intersection of a very busy street, even at that time of night, which happened to be just a few hundred feet from the highway we started our adventure on, I was debating whether or not to light her up for public safety since I was equipped with lights and siren. Thankfully, at the last moment, she whips into a convenience store parking lot, jumps out of the car, flipping me the bird, and goes into the store. At this point, I was parked right behind her car, so there was no way she could have left if she wanted to. Also, I'm in full uniform. An officer from City PD arrived. I gave him the rundown, knew they'd go over every turn, every stop sign, red light, and lane she'd violated from my recorded phone call, and she'd be getting a buttload of tickets. Anyway, City PD says he has to wait for backup before he'll go in. I then looked at myself carefully up and down, then said, "Why wait? I'll back you up." It clicks, and his face went red because he hadn't thought of it himself. As we approached the front of the store, the lady was actually on her way out. She sees us standing there and is walking quite odd. City PD tells her to put her arms up. She does so by holding her upper arms firmly to her body, then turns them slightly, only holding up her lower arms. He then tells her, "Higher." She raised her right arm. An object falls and smashes all over the ground. So at this point, we've got her for DWI. She blew like a .20. shoplifting 2 beers, which were what fell to the ground. She had warrants, and on search following her arrest for tow of her vehicle, they found weed in the car. I was a cop for 12 years. The first 5, I worked full-time in dispatch at a county sheriff's office, where I was also deputy sheriff, and worked as a reserve patrolman in another county. There was an opening that came up in one of the towns that I dispatched for, and even though I really wanted to take it, I just couldn't. The sad fact was, I made more money sitting behind the desk dispatching law enforcement, fire and rescue units than most of the officers and paid FD members I was dispatching. So anyway, all of my time as a cop, this one ranks up there as one of the funniest arrests I ever took part in. Both the city PD and I burst into laughter as those beers hit the ground. I was summoned to appear on behalf of the city in court, but she took a plea for some jail time, community service, and suspension of her license for 6 months. I recall doing a job in 2017. I was working the 10 PM to 6 AM night shift in an Australian town known for high amounts of domestic violence. About 1:30 that morning, my partner and I were sent code 2, lights and sirens, to a DV incident. Shortly after arriving, my partner and I walked up to the address we were sent to and found a male and female along with another female. The other female was quite distressed. She claimed she had been hit over the head with a guitar, bleeding a little and extremely emotional. She immediately told us how her boyfriend in the house next door was going to kill himself because they were breaking up, and that we had to get over there right now. She wasn't in too bad a way, so figured we would just make sure everything was alright next door. My partner and I went to the front door of the neighbouring house, and immediately through the fly screen, saw pools of blood. Calling it a bloodbath was an accurate description. That's when we went, oh crap. The fly screen was locked, and an expensive type, not easily ripped off its hinges like others. I've gone to a nearby window, withdrew my baton and smashed the window in. I climbed through the window, and knowing that I'm going to get into a domestic violence incident and that blood has already been spilled, I draw my gun and commence clearance of rooms. I went to the front door to let my partner in. Sadly, it was key locked and couldn't be simply unlatched and opened, so I did what I had to and kicked it in. After 3 attempts, struggling to keep my balance after slipping on pools of blood, the screen door flies across the front yard and my partner is able to get in. Shortly into this, I found a man, face down in his own blood, and I mean dark, congealed blood in the kitchen. He had a fork in his hand, pieces of glass from where the oven had been smashed, and just a feast for the senses. No house lighting on, so working in torchlight, blood everywhere. The smell of liquor and sweat and blood. I can still put myself there nearly 18 months on. We couldn't get the fork out of his hand initially, so we threw some handcuffs on to maintain some control. I can still remember reaching down, grabbing his wrist, and feeling my hands going into his arms and feeling bone and tendons. A DV investigation has now launched into saving this guy's life. We had only recently received training in the management of trauma wounds and knew I had a compression kit in the car. I called urgent on the radio, a phrase that gets everyone's attention, and requested another car and a heckload of ambulances. I run out of the scene, still slipping on the floors covered in blood, grabbed the trauma kit from the car and ran back in. As soon as I was out, I'm back in ripping into the trauma kit and applying a tourniquet to the guy's arm, packing his wounds with gauze and keeping pressure on to keep the bleeding under control. It could have been as short as 2 minutes, but felt like an eternity for the ambulance to arrive. The sirens could be heard in the background, but only gradually got louder and louder. When the ambos turn up, it's their show now. We help out by clearing space and holding bags of saline while they assess. Unbeknownst to us, he had a stab wound in his chest, and the sac around his heart was punctured and filling with blood, slowly stopping his heart from pumping. The advanced care paramedic looked back at us and asked who put this tourniquet on. I replied and was immediately told that I'd just saved this man's life. He was not in a good way, but was already out of the cusp of death. The ambos got him out of the scene, and it all goes from crazy and manic to routine. My supervisor told me to post a notice of damage for the broken window and door, and straight back to the station to do the paperwork. Domestic violence to a cop is always a job you just hate going to, not for the fact that it happened, but often talking to people older than you on how to be in a relationship with each other, and knowing that you'll most likely be there next week dealing with the same thing. This went from my partner and I whinging about that, to breaking into a house, fearing we would have to deal with an armed male, to getting covered in blood and saving a life. I'm proud of what I did, and sadly, this is just one story in a cast of others that I could say I've gone, oh crap. All I wanted was a quiet night. It was a rainy night, and I took the overtime to cover the midnight shift. I reasoned that the rain would keep most people inside, and I had a good chance of having a quiet night. I was wrong. I was told later that using the Q word would jinx an officer every time. I got a call about midnight from dispatch. It was what we called a check on welfare call. These are usually not the calls you receive at this time of night. Generally, they are when an elderly person hadn't been heard from in a couple of days, or isn't answering the phone. A loved one who doesn't live close by will ask us to check on them. I didn't particularly like these calls, and not to sound callous, but old people often die in their sleep or from a fall, and, well, it's not my favorite call to answer. In this case, dispatch notified me that this elderly woman's front door was partly open, and a neighbor rightfully thought it suspicious. As I get close to the location, I see the neighbor, the teenage boy who lives down the road, is standing in the middle of the street waving his arms. I know this teen from earlier contacts. He was a large kid who would hang around with the wrong crowd, but was more of a misfit kid trying to fit in with the bad kids. This kid is known to be quite the storyteller and would make things up and would report them to the police from time to time. I think he did this to feel important. I thanked him for the call and approached the house. It's one of those old two-story bungalow type houses, which is long and narrow but sat alone on a small hill with a nice size rear fenced yard. I can see the front door is open a little, so I push it all the way open and find this 80-year-old woman lying face down next to the door. There was some blood near her hand and around her nose, but that was it. I quickly felt for a pulse, and as soon as I touched her, I could feel her body was ice cold, and of course, no pulse. I didn't know if she had fallen, which is common, or if she was the victim of foul play. I decided to quickly clear the house on the chance that foul play was involved, and the criminal actor might still be inside. I drew my gun and almost ran through the house. I remember running up the stairs and getting to a bedroom. What I saw in the bedroom left little doubt. I observed that the dresser drawers had been removed from that piece of furniture and dumped on the bed. This made quite a mess in an otherwise neat, well-kept home. I immediately knew that her death involved foul play and called my sergeant to the location, and also called for additional units to establish a scene. That's clear cop talk for I have a homicide. I spent the entire night at the crime scene with that poor old woman. This was the first time I had discovered someone murdered. Unfortunately, it would not be my last. But in this case, it was new to me and made quite an impression. I was like a sponge taking it all in. I watched a crime scene officer, the coroner, and the detectives all work the scene in search of the same answer. Who could do such a horrible thing to a helpless old woman? At some point, they rolled the victim over, and it was apparent then that she had been indescribably beaten to death. The trauma to her frail little body made her hard to recognize. The one thing I can still see 25 years later is her outstretched hand. 2 fingernails broke off, stuck in the flooring, with bloody scrape marks from her nails, as if she was trying to pull herself away from some evil. I remember going home that morning and being unable to sleep after working 16 hours. I had a grandmother who lived alone in a house, not unlike the victim's home. I made a rookie mistake of internalizing the carnage I had observed, equating it to my own grandmother. This case bothered me at some level for quite a while. The detectives assigned to the case did a great job, and by morning, had 3 juveniles in custody with confessions. It turned out to be a robbery that went very wrong. It all came back to that fat kid who had first reported the open door. It turns out that he would do yard work for the old woman, cutting her grass and raking leaves. He also hung out with the 3 juvenile murderers. He told them a tall tale about being invited into the old woman's home for a cold drink of water after cutting her lawn. He then asked to use the bathroom, and while away from the woman, had snuck upstairs to her room. He described finding drawers full of cash in her bedroom. They were all lies that he told, for whatever reason, but it had cost the old woman her life. These 3 almost adult juveniles had knocked on an old woman's door. She opened it a crack, and they said it was a robbery. The door had a chain on it, so they kicked the door in to gain full entry. In doing so, the door hit the woman in the face, breaking her nose. She fell on the floor screaming. The screaming set the 3 off, and they literally punched and stomped this brittle old woman to death. According to the autopsy report, they broke nearly every bone in her frail elderly body. These 3 young criminals didn't go to trial, but took a negotiated sentence. They were away in prison for a while, but not nearly long enough. I was still a cop when they got out, maybe 7 or 8 years later. When I would see them, I would feel my blood pressure rising. I made it a point not to interact with them, as I wasn't confident I would be able to control the feelings of rage I had towards them. When I worked in narcotics, I would often be called upon to either work in an undercover capacity or set up and monitor audio and video electronic surveillance equipment. I was called back to my department from a task force assignment to work on a case involving a gentleman who was looking to hire a hitman to kill his wife. The detective working the case wanted to act as a gun for hire, but wanted me to set up and monitor an undercover car with audio and video surveillance equipment. The following night, this 50-something-year-old man meets with a detective/hitman and explains in detail not only that he wants his wife killed, but when, where, and how. He explains that she works a night shift and comes out at a specific time to take a smoke break. The man wants his wife shot in the head from a distance with a rifle. He agreed to a price and gave some money to the undercover officer and then left the meeting. Fearing that this guy wasn't stable and might take matters into his own hands, we reached out and transported his wife from her job to the station. When she was told of her husband's plans, she became hysterical and went to pieces. He had given her no indication that he was unhappy with their marriage. Next, we had uniform officers pick up this gentleman killer. I got to do his interview. I discussed the situation with him for about 20 minutes, and he continually denied trying to hire anyone to harm his wife. He knew we had the hitman at the station, but didn't know he was a cop. He accused him of lying and setting him up, and even blackmailing him. I let this go for a while, so anyone later listening to his recorded statement would see the depth of his lies. I then gave the signal to the hitman/undercover officer to enter the room. The door opens, and in walks the hitman wearing his gun and badge. Well, the man just dropped his head in disbelief. The next words out of his mouth, I still to this day cannot believe. "Well, she's got bad hips," he said, referring to her arthritis. So he was intending to have his wife murdered, shot in the head, because she had hip pain. We learned later, although not from him, of the more realistic motives involving an insurance policy, gambling debts, and a relationship with a sex worker. The case didn't need to go to trial, as he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to many years in prison. But never before, or since that day, have I heard such a disturbing reason to murder your own wife: having bad hips. I was on patrol behind a strip mall when a call came over about someone being attacked in the front parking lot in the bar at the front of that very mall. I drove around to the front in seconds, knowing that backup was minutes away. As I pulled up, one man had a long iron pole in his hands, raised up as if he was ready to strike another man on the ground with it. The other was looking up at him with his hands up, apparently defensively. This was before tasers, and there was a huge crowd surrounding all this. So even though this looked like a deadly force situation, I decided not to draw my gun. I literally walked right up to them and, using my voice of command, told him to drop the pole. The man holding the pole started to say something, but I told him again, in a tone of voice that he could not mistake or argue with, and he dropped it. I kicked the pole out of reach under a car and stood myself directly between these two men, when just moments ago it appeared that one was ready to kill the other. I told both of them to say nothing and stay still until the other officers began to arrive. From a purely tactical standpoint, it was probably the stupidest move I ever made. I knew nothing about these two men or why they appeared to be ready to kill each other. I had no idea who in the crowd was on which side, if either. And here, I was standing within arm's length of both of them, dominating and controlling a potential deadly force situation, with nothing more than fearless officer presence. As it turned out, I had done exactly the right thing, although I would have been justified in shooting the man with the pole if I could have done so without putting anyone in the crowd at risk. What was discovered after interviewing the two men and witnesses in the crowd: the man holding the pole was the bar bouncer. The man on the ground had been kicked out of the bar earlier and was not happy about it. He tore down a street sign for the iron pole that had been holding it up and waited to ambush the bouncer with it at closing time. As it happened, the bouncer had just managed to grab the pole away from the man and pulled it away with enough force that it was over his head at the moment I arrived. The man on the ground, of course, had his hands raised as the pole had just been pulled out of them by the bouncer. If I had used my gun, I would have shot the bouncer who was defending himself from this attacker. I had arrived at just the right moment when everything appeared exactly the opposite. I took command of a potentially deadly situation with no backup and without using a weapon, and as a result, wound up not shooting the wrong person. This was the most memorable moment of my career, and although no one else at the time had a clue, the scariest, standing between two guys that appeared to be intent on killing each other. This is the reality of police work. Split-second life or death decisions made with minimal information and putting ourselves in immense danger to minimize the risk to onlookers and others on the scene. I've been a cop for 16 years at a large agency in a capital city in the southeastern United States. And about 2 years into my career, I somehow ended up with the need for elbow surgery. The surgery didn't affect the mechanics of my elbow, so I was approved for light duty after a couple of days of post-op. My light duty assignment was a 12-hour night shift at the front desk, answering citizen calls and taking reports over the phone. Nobody likes this kind of stuff, but you know how it goes. So one night, it's unusually quiet due to a particularly nasty series of thunderstorms rolling through the area. It's about 2 a.m. when a call comes through to my line. I answer the phone and an old woman's voice comes quietly over the line. She's almost whispering. She says she needs help, that she doesn't know where she is, and that it's very dark. I thought I may have a client or patient from a care facility, or maybe someone's mother with Alzheimer's was on the line. So I suggested that she try looking for someone where she was to help her. I told her to call out for someone. Then I asked for her address. She wouldn't provide the information, or rather, she seemed not to hear me. I got the same response when I asked for her name. She took my advice though, and started calling out, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" I could tell she was on a landline, because there was a soft clunk whenever she put the phone down and she walked away from the phone, but could still be heard calling out, "Hello?" repeatedly, as she walked around wherever she was. At times, she would get closer to the phone and her voice would become louder. Then at other times, she would grow faint. Wherever she was, it sounded like a rather big room or building, and somewhat empty, as there was a slight echo quality. She continued to wander around, calling out hello repeatedly. After a few minutes, I tried to get her attention by saying, "Ma'am," loudly several times, in an attempt to get her to return to the phone. I was hoping to help her formulate a new plan, but she didn't return to the phone. Instead, she continued to wander around wherever she was, calling out, "Hello?" I put her on speaker so that the desk sergeant and another deputy on light duty could hear what was going on. After a few more minutes and attempts to get the woman to return to the phone, I called dispatch from another line, leaving the woman's call open, and asked dispatch to find me an address for the number that the woman was calling from. Once I had the address, I hit the radio for a patrol unit working that area to give me a call. I gave him the rundown and requested that he go to the address to make contact with someone at the location, or possibly to assist the old lady. I heard him tell dispatch that he was on his way to the address for a follow-up. The old lady was still on the line, wandering around and calling out. After about 10 minutes, I heard the deputy request a repeat of the address, to which dispatch obliged, reaffirming the original address. There was a few seconds of silence. Then he went, "On scene," with the 10 code. After another minute or so, my other line rings. It's the responding deputy, and the old woman is still on the line, with our end on mute. The deputy asks me to confirm the address one more time, so I do. He pauses, then says, "This location is a pile of rubble. The house burned down years ago." At that moment, the line with the old woman went silent. Call duration on her line was around 23 minutes. Not knowing what else to say, I thanked him and he went 10-8. Sarge and I just stared at each other. That was 13 years ago, and we haven't talked about it since. Still creeps me out. Here's another one. Our squad was working at 7 PM to 7 AM in an urban region, and at around the witching hour, a call goes out for an animal complaint. We get these often, and they're usually in reference to dogs, but it's pretty unusual to get one so late at night. It was another slow night, probably a Thursday or something, and most of the squad showed up, including the supervisor. The complainant described what she saw. She said she came out of her apartment to smoke a cigarette, and she saw what she initially thought was a stray dog, but instead of the normal pit bull mix that's so common in the region, it looked like a black hyena. It was just standing there, about 30 yards away, just in that twilight between light and dark of a lamp in the common space. She said that it looked wrong, and the way it looked at her made her uncomfortable, so she yelled at it. It moved away from her, sort of parallel, and she said it ran like a chimpanzee, planting its hands and sort of scampering with its back feet forward between its hands. She pointed at a wooded lot and said that once it hit the tree line, she heard what sounded like bark scraping, like it possibly climbed a tree. We were only about 6 or 7 minutes behind it, so we spread out with our flashlights to check the wooded lot. We had a large, aging zoo in our region, and we often joked that it was a matter of time before we were looking for escaped zebras or something. Well, I got about 40 yards into the woods, and I heard a scrabbling sound. Then, a crash in the limbs above me. I swung my light up and was disappointed. Back then, we were issued old rechargeable Surefire Stinger lights with nickel metal hydride batteries, and their operational time was miserable. More than 20 minutes of runtime or so, and it gets really dim. That was the state of my light at the time, so I was able to only get a glimpse of something that was black, hairy, and about the size of a Saint Bernard as it jumped from a thick branch about 30 feet or so above my head. It was in my light for a moment before it jumped out, making a sound sort of like a mixture of a baby crying and a power drill. When it left the branch, I expected another inevitable crash as it hit another branch, but there was nothing. It was as if it had taken flight. We were so concerned that we actually called the on-call number for the zoo and insisted that they do a check on their animals to make sure they're all accounted for. They checked, and they were. The thing was strange, with a shape similar to a dog, but with the movements of an ape. We took to calling it the monkey dog, but we never saw it again, despite the occasional call for service from the area about an unidentified animal spotted. So I was a sheriff's deputy who often worked in a very remote area in Florida, where despite most of my shift being in town as a floater, I was often the one to take calls out in the middle of friggin' nowhere when one would actually come in at night. So this is one of those areas where you went out to check on things and didn't see another human for well over an hour. One of those areas where you drove down roads in the pitch black, where if you actually responded with your lights and sirens on, they were on for so long that you got tired of hearing them when there was actually a crash or a call because the drive took so long, even at high speed. So one night, I'm driving in the furthest reaches, where our in-car radios only sometimes pick up. Our walkie-talkies never do. And my Nextel cell phone is about as useless as the flip phone brick that it was. This was 2009, not exactly the olden times, because I damn sure wasn't getting reception out there. Not only that, but I'm on a dirt road, only as wide as my patrol car, after checking on a gate people had found left open that was letting people ride ATVs on the back of a state preserve and onto private property. I had already darted out of my car with my lights on full and shut the gate, lest anyone or anything sneak up on me in the dark. Out there's literally 15-foot gators in the tall grass between small creeks, and I was never a fan of going back there alone. Hell, the only call we'd had in years was someone kicking in a farmhouse door to a home that years before had been a grow house out in the middle of nowhere. The guy who kicked down the door, armed and demanding the drugs that used to be there, was shot by the owner, dead, long before we ever arrived. There was video. It was a legit bad dude with a long violent record who ended up dead. That call had taken 47 minutes for deputies to arrive at, and you can imagine we weren't exactly taking our time. So anyway, there I am in the pitch black, except a full moon peeking through the trees, trying not to admit that I'm a fully grown, armed adult, scared of the dark at this point. And I jump back in my car and start back down this long dirt road towards Highway 31, a highway that sees long-haul trucks and not much more, when a voice, loud and clear, comes over my radio. Now, mind you, because it's crackly and breaking up badly, I had my music radio all the way down and my car radio up loud, so I could try to hear dispatch while out there, as well as my squad back in civilization. This was 3 AM, and already a pretty slow night, and through the blackness, it was completely quiet. To make the weirdness clear, at that time of night, I'm the only woman on our radio. Both our dispatchers on duty were men. Our dispatch supervisor was out having a baby, and I worked with 7 guys. The other district on our radio was a squad of 9 guys. During the day, sure, you'll hear detectives, other units, but at night, I'm the only female voice on the radio at all. So, the first thing that's come through my radio in over an hour that isn't almost entirely static is a woman's voice, loud and clear. The voice says, in a very haunting tone, "Hello," almost in a sing-song way. And that's it. The radio cuts back out. A few seconds later, static cuts through, but no voices. I stare at my laptop, almost in horror. It's very friggin' creepy. I wait about 30 seconds and stop my car, still deep in the woods, but I'm not about to try driving and typing. I type into the dispatch chat, so, what was that? Over the radio, a very staticky male dispatcher asks, 336, 10-4? As in, am I okay? I respond by typing again, because I know it's unlikely they'll hear me on the radio clearly anyway. I type, I'm 10-4, but what was that last transmission? My phone rings on my belt. I try to answer, and I can tell it's my sergeant, but I can't get a signal. Nothing comes across my terminal, so I start driving again while waiting for an answer. Several minutes pass. I finally get on State Road 31 and make my way towards the highway, hoping I'll get reception instead of going north through the shorter but very much backwoods route. Finally, my phone gets service and my boss calls again. "Hey, did you get on the radio out there? Some of us got what sounded like a transmission, but it didn't sound like your voice. Everything okay?" I'm like, "Dude, look at the chat. That wasn't me. I was asking dispatch the same thing. So you did hear that?" He tells me only some of the radios in the office picked it up. There were 3 guys and a canine officer in the office, and the night shift watch commander, and only 2 of the 6 radios actually picked it up, even though they were all fairly close in proximity. Apparently, because I'm the only female on the radio, and they all know I'm in the middle of nowhere, they all started calling my cell and trying to raise me on the radio, and I hadn't answered at all. I didn't hear or get any calls or radio transmissions except that voice. Apparently, in the office, the guys in the squad room thought it was the supervisor playing something in his office on the computer, because no one could figure out how only a couple of radios came to life. We're all on the same channel after all. I was the only one who heard the transmission loud and clear. By the time I got back to the office, my hair was all standing on end, and the creepy ghost on the radio was all anyone could talk about. Some people were not convinced it wasn't me trying to make a transmission after several attempts. But even if I had, I wouldn't have said hello. They would have heard me calling out my number or asking for dispatch, not some random creepy sing-song greeting. We never solved it. I can only imagine the transmission was from some kind of radio that managed to get onto our secure law enforcement channel, and that the source was way closer to me than anyone else, including dispatch back in the heart of town. I never got any kind of explanation, and since some people still thought it was me, even though everyone agreed it didn't sound like me at all, it was a creepy-ass mystery that was never solved. Despite taking calls that involved gunshots, other deputies not answering after being toned out, a couple of pretty intense fires, and some really high-stress situations, it was still one of the creepiest things that stayed with me long after I retired from my law enforcement career. Whatever it was, the timing was terrifying, and I couldn't help wonder if whomever or whatever got onto the radio knew there was a cop, alone, in the dark, in the middle of the deep-ass woods, with no real contact with the world, when they decided it would be hilarious to scare the hell out of me. Until other people confirmed hearing it, and they didn't even hear it clearly, I was starting to wonder if I was literally hearing things entirely.